it might bring down the whole banking industry with it. And they kept repeating that year after year. And there were others. Some were economists, financial journalists, others. But those signals were disregarded. And this is very typical of warnings. And one reason is simply that warnings, almost by definition, are premature. That is, even if someone has real insight into what's going to happen, it's very difficult to pinpoint the time when it's going to happen. So when The Economist in 2002 said there was a housing bubble and was going to burst, the next year they had to say in an embarrassed editorial, well, you know, it hasn't happened and we're being called doomsters and so on, but it'll happen, it'll happen, and it'll be worse the longer it's deferred, which was correct. But it still took another 5 years, at which time they're derided. And you know that if you think, you know, I don't think there's a noun for Warner. There's a Cassandra, there's a doomster, there's an Eeyore, there's a prophet of doom, but there's no positive word for someone who issues warnings. So it's easy to dismiss the warners because their warnings are premature. And then often it would be costly to try to prevent the catastrophe. And since, you know, most people don't think it's going to happen, it's a comfortable course. It probably won't happen. It'll be very costly to prevent. And the third reason is that it's very difficult to get credit for preventing something that doesn't happen, because the fact that it didn't happen means it doesn't have any real salience. And also the fact that it didn't happen, it's always very uncertain. Why didn't it happen? Maybe, I mean, suppose we had somehow taken military measures that would have made Pearl Harbor invulnerable, and then the Japanese decide not to attack. But it would take many years actually to discover that the reason the Japanese hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor was that they'd been deterred by our defensive preparations. And in fact, the short-term reaction would be, suppose, so the Japanese don't attack Pearl Harbor, but they still attack the Philippines and Malaya and Indonesia. So everyone said, look, you guys spent all your money fortifying Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese were going after something else. And then you try to explain, well, yeah, but they might have attacked this, but it's too, you know. So all of the incentives operate against paying attention to warning signals. And Greenspan was actually explicit about this. He said, yeah, he said he didn't think there was a housing bubble, but he said if there is a bubble, it would be a mistake for the Federal Reserve to puncture the bubble, because then they get blamed, right? Then they get blamed. So they raised interest rates, bubble bursts, housing prices fall. People won't say, well, Federal Reserve had to do that. The bubble was expanding. It would be worse if it had lasted longer and burst by its own force. They would say, look, everything was going great. Housing prices were rising, and the Federal Reserve got timid and went in and raised interest rates, and it ruined the housing market. So he was very explicit about that you wouldn't get credit for bursting a bubble because most people would believe there wasn't a bubble. So that's one set of reasons why you don't get people taking warnings seriously. But there's more to it, and the reason there has to be more to it is that, and what I find very perplexing about this, I can see why Bernanke, Bernanke is not only a distinguished student of the Depression, but he had emphasized more than other economists that a critical precipitant of a depression is a failure of the banking industry. And that had actually occurred in Japan. And in 1990, Japan had a housing bubble burst, and its banking industry collapsed, and it spent 10 years sort of climbing back. So that, of course, could happen. So Bernanke would have known that even if he didn't think it was a bubble, didn't believe the economists or anything like that, he had to know there was some risk, maybe very small risk. But why couldn't he, or why didn't he tell some of his staff in the Federal Reserve, say, look, you know, there are these naysayers, and they say there's a bubble, it's going to burst, and if it bursts, it brings down the banking industry. I don't believe it. I think it's very unlikely. But go ahead, look into it, investigate it, and make some contingency plans. So if we're surprised by some housing crisis or some banking crisis, we'll have a plan to roll out. Well, the reason that wasn't done, I think, is another problem, and that's the problem of overconfidence. So, there was the Great Depression of the 30s, and there hadn't been a depression in the United States since. And the economists took credit for the fact there hadn't been a depression since. They said they had learned from the Depression how to prevent depressions. And Robert Lucas, a very distinguished Nobel Prize-winning macroeconomist at the University of Chicago, had said in 2003 in his presidential address to the American Economic Association that the economics profession had solved the problem of depressions, and there was no longer any reason for economists to interest themselves in depression economics. They should move on to other areas. And with that kind of overconfidence, not only was it easy for Bernanke and other distinguished economists to brush off these concerns about a housing crisis or banking crisis. They say, well, we know how to deal with those problems. If we see the economy deteriorating, we force down interest rates, we flood the economy with money, and people then, with credit very cheap, they buy things, and economic activity quickly revives. So with that degree of overconfidence, you take no preparatory. But also the macroeconomists took Lucas seriously, and there's still some historical economic stuff about depressions, but they stopped really worrying about depressions. And as a result, when this hit last fall, the macroeconomists did not know what to do. They do not know what to do. So you can see how a successful social science like economics, the only field of social science that has a Nobel Prize in it, not part of Alfred Nobel's will, but a gift of the Swedish bank, you can see how confident, highly mathematized, disciplined, well-paid, very smart people can become overconfident and be completely surprised by the world that didn't fit their models. And that's another point, that a field can be very strong in terms of formal logic, but unless it has good methods of empirical testing, its relation to the world will remain untested. And it is very difficult to do empirical research about depressions because they are rare events in the life of a particular nation. Because they are rare, they tend to arise at long intervals, and then that means they're arising in very different economic contexts. You can look at depressions abroad, but then you have to compare different nations, different cultures, economic cultures, social cultures, propensities to save money, all sorts of relevant things differ. So it's very difficult to test various hypotheses about depressions. And finally, there is a tendency, I think, in any field to want to kind of, you'd like your model to conform to reality. But if you're not able to do that 100%, you'd like to conform reality to the model. So you play with it. And so, and in this respect, there's a very striking a development that Professor Marlin again referred to, and that's the revival of John Maynard Keynes. So Keynes wrote his great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in 1935, I think, 35 or 36. And he became a great figure in economics. But in recent decades, his star faded. And if you look in modern macroeconomic texts, you find very few references to Keynes. And he was considered